And joining us now, Canada's 19th Prime Minister, Kim Campbell. Welcome home.
Thank you very much.
What are you doing here?
I'm just hanging out.
You don't live in Canada anymore, so what brings you back to...
Well, I come as often as I can for, various reasons. I'm here because on the 30th, which is tomorrow, are we date specific? I'm speaking at the Canadian Club, which is having a lunch in cooperation with Equal Voice. And Equal Voice is presenting me with the EVE Award in recognition of my not always successful attempts at the advancement of women. But
you are still the one and only female Prime Minister.
Yes, and I wouldn't mind a little company. I'm looking forward to it before I conk, I hope.
Well, before you what?
Before I conk.
Before you conk, okay. Well, one of the reasons we wanted you here is, of course, later this week, Michael Ignatieff is going to be crowned as the new Liberal leader. And you know what it is like, perhaps as much as anybody who's alive today, to take over a party in which you don't have long-standing, traditional, deep roots. Of course, he was living out of the country for 30 years. You belong to a different party in your provincial political days. So I want to start by quoting from your book, Time and Chance. Perhaps the most significant aspect of my political beginnings, you say, is that I started my career as an elected person in a context where party was relatively unimportant, because I didn't come up through a party organization. My primary point of reference has always been the voter, not the party. In the years to come, I found this gave me a different perspective on the nature and uses of political power from that of some of the people I met. Can you just flesh that out a little bit for us? How does that affect your perspective of a politician, knowing that you didn't come up like Jean Chrétien with 30, 40 years background in the same party?
Well, I should point out, too, that part of it also has to do with being a woman, because when I was a young woman at university, for example, a lot of my male counterparts got involved in political party clubs, but they weren't very congenial to girls in my generation. I mean, you were welcome to be part of it if you didn't mind making the coffee and if you wanted to go out and work on election campaigns. But it was the boys who got to go to Ottawa and be executive assistants to ministers, who got to be, who were seen as people to be recruited. And people like, for example, Brian Mulroney's generation, he's older than me, but it was very similar in my own time. But these were the young up-and-comers for whom, apprenticeships were the thing to do when you joined a party. It wasn't that open for girls. So it wasn't, even when I began to think about politics, it wasn't something that seemed to be the right thing to do. And when I was a political science professor at UBC, when I first started teaching in the mid-70s, I had a young student who was in fact the president of the Young PCs of Canada. And he had given me some of Bob Stanfield's speeches, which I liked very much. And I said to him, I've often thought that I might like to go into politics someday. And I said, but I'm not even involved in a party. He said, if you want to go into politics, don't get involved in a party, become a star. And it was very, very wise advice. What he was saying. From a kid. Yeah, and what he was saying is, and he grew up to be a wonderful man and always has been very wise, but that I think in general, it's often the case that being a stalwart party worker isn't always rewarded with the candidacy. It can be, it depends on where you are. But for women in particular, it's very hard for people to change from thinking of you as the stalwarts. But I think Flora MacDonald found that. I mean, she was an incredible strength in the Conservative Party, but some people were kind of surprised that she began to see herself as perhaps a potential leader. Well, oh no, wait a minute, we draw the line there. So the idea of becoming a star, and the idea is that if you become known in your community, that parties will come to you and look to you, and then you have to figure out, where am I most at home? Which parties, positions, platforms, ideologies are most congenial to the way I think and what I see for the country. And
you did become a star, and I wonder if when you finally became leader of the party and prime minister of the country, whether that turned out to be a problem for you, because you did not have this 25-year history with the PC party to call upon for fundraising, for organization, for advisors and all of that.
Well, I think that's also part of the fact that when you're the leader, no matter who you are, you have to have a whole network of people. You have to bring people together, and I had no problem doing that. And I recognized early on there were people who had these deep roots. And when I said that in my book, it wasn't because I have a contempt for parties or suspicion. On the contrary, in fact, one of the things that concerns me most, I do a lot of work internationally on democracy promotion. And one of the things that concerns me is that people are often talking about, oh, let's strengthen civil society. But political parties are absolutely essential to functioning democracies. They give the voters choice. They organize people. And part of the problem is that in some of the emerging democracies, the parties are themselves kind of immature, that they're leader parties. They follow a particular leader as opposed to being organizations that speak for a particular point of view or a particular set of policy options.
I don't know how much you followed Michael Ignatieff's first leadership run the first time around when he lost to Stéphane Dion. but you heard it all the time at that convention, which was, he's been out of the country for 30 years, he hasn't paid his dues, he comes up here on a white horse and he thinks he can just take the top job. Did you get much of that, given that you'd been 5 years as a cabinet minister,
no,
but not 25?
I don't think I got that so much. Oddly enough, one of the people who I got that from was Joe Clark, who made some comment about sort of, that a stranger had taken over his party. But, even when I was in Parliament, I spent a lot of time in my colleagues' ridings. I, was often asked to go and speak, and I went wherever I could. And I genuinely respected them, and I really tried to bring them in and to create, particularly the difficult issues I dealt with as Justice Minister, to create a kind of collegial and collaborative approach to policymaking. And I've commented this before, that Pierre Trudeau once said that members of Parliament, when they're off the Parliament Hill, they're nobodies. And I think it's just the opposite. I think when you take time to go and visit somebody, your own party or another, a member of Parliament in his or her constituency, that's when you come to understand what they're doing in Ottawa, because usually these are people who've done something important in their riding. They've been successful in their business or their career, or if they've served at local government, or they've served in community organizations. And very often these are people that their fellow community members come to and say, wouldn't you like to run? Sometimes they're people who kind of generate their own political ambition, and that's okay too. But they don't get there by being total doofuses. But often when they're in Parliament Hill, and particularly if their party's in government, they don't really get a chance to shine. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and when I wrote my manifesto, Doing Politics Differently, I talked about how important it was to try and make it possible for backbenchers on the government side to make a bigger contribution and a more visible contribution, because they fight tooth and nail for their constituents, but nobody sees it because they're supposed to maintain the kind of the discipline and solidarity of the party caucus. And opposition members don't have those same constraints. They have some of those constraints, but not quite so strongly as if you're in the governing party. And I think it's a pity, because I think Canadians don't see that their MPs are in fact arguing. I mean, I think on the gun control stuff, boy, I had a few flesh wounds myself on that particular issue.
You think, and that issue's still around? That hasn't gone anywhere.
Never goes away.
No. When you look though at the prime ministers of this country who have been the most successful, and you look at the model, is it still better if you've come up through the party, steeped in party knowledge, lots of contacts along the way, or is it better to be a kind of a shooting star?
I don't think there is a single model. I think it depends upon what you do when you get the job. I mean, interestingly, Brian Mulroney, of course, had deep experience in the party, but he had never held elected office anywhere before he was elected leader of the party. And he had that period of time as leader of the opposition, but he'd never been in government. And it's not the same being the EA to Alvin Hamilton as it is to be in government. And I think it took him 2 years to get used to being yelled at, to being the target of hostility. And I think that in that first mandate, the Tories lost a precious 2 years that alienated a lot of people who had counted on them to get elected and then go in and deal with the deficit and those kinds of things. But you can't deal with those issues without making some people angry. And it takes a while to understand that that's what goes with the territory. So you can have, I mean, by the time I got to Ottawa, I was, already a walking pincushion. I'd annoyed people already at 2 levels of government and was ready to take on the third. So in that sense, I think I had a lot more experience and a lot more understanding of that kind of public process that you engage in when you're a policymaker, whether you're chairing the school board in Vancouver, you're in the legislature, you're in Parliament. Even though I didn't have the kind of know where all the bodies were buried in the party, although I tried to gather around me people who did.
Well, let me follow up.
Don't step there, there's a body.
Let me follow up on that, because here's another quote from your book, and this I'll pull a question out of this afterwards. In her diary entry, Pamela Davinsky, your stepdaughter, wrote, "In Sarnia, the PM is distressed." This is you. "She doesn't think that the team is on her side. Part of the problem is that the team members are not her people, but rather from the Charest team, whom you beat, or from the Mulroney team, whom you succeeded. At the same time, she is not Mulroney and continues to be treated as if she were. For example, everywhere we go, the temperature in autos, buildings, and planes is very cold, which was Mulroney's desire. It is not hers. In general, she's not accommodated as Kim Campbell, but rather is treated as a second-place Mulroney." Now, I know you dealt with this when the book came out, but there's got to be, I think, an assumption in the population that when you take over the leadership of the party, you can get the thermostat set the way you want. You can get the advance team to do what you want. Is it not that way?
Well, you can, but I think what Pamela was commenting about too was also a reflection of time. You know, Brian Mulroney stepped down halfway through the 5th year of our mandate. And, you know, if you don't get out after 5 years, you know, they come with a hook and carry you out because that's it, folks. Your time is up. And so, for example, in choosing the campaign team, I didn't have time to kind of go through the process of figuring out who was really good, who wasn't, who were my people that should be involved. And also, when you've just won a leadership, you have to reach out and bring in people from other camps to reunite the party after a very fractious leadership battle. So if there had been a year in which I could have had the time to get to know people, figured out who I wanted to make part of my team, who were people I could trust, let them get to know me. And remember, it wasn't just that they didn't know me, many of them did know me, but I was the first woman. And, you know, however intellectually people accept the idea of, isn't this great, we have a woman leader, I was different. And for some of them, kind of getting over, you know, I talk about it in the book, Brian Mulroney liked to be called boss. Well, little girls don't like to be called boss. Little girls grow up being, you know, learning that being called bossy is an insult.
What did you want to be called?
I want to be called, you know, PM, chief, whatever. What made people happy if they want to have a nickname. But it's just that you've got this whole structure and there is no time to change it. If people have time to get to know you, to understand your particular peccadillos, if you have time to, or idiosyncrasies, no, they aren't all peccadillos, I hope, you have time to go to Parliament, to, you know, actually pass some legislation, actually live out your promises. I know there was, for example, there was big debate, oh, you should call Parliament back and have a speech from the throne. And I said, but that's a kind of a inside the beltway view, assuming that Canadians think a speech from the throne is more significant than an election manifesto. If you don't have time to act on the speech from the throne, if you cannot then enter into a legislative process and show what you're doing, I mean, it's just another election platform. You know, it's a nice one. You get the Governor General to read it for you, but it's not really any different. And I don't think most people outside of the of Ottawa insiders think that promises you've made that you don't have time to deliver on mean something more when you make them, you know, from the Senate chamber through the mouth of the Governor General than if you make them an election platform and you're out there stumping the country.
Do you know Michael Ignatieff, incidentally?
I do know him. Yes, I know him. I met him at Harvard. Yeah.
Were you there at the same time? You
Yes.
taught there at the same time?
Yes.
Have you ever talked about, I mean, the challenges you went through and how he can avoid it, that kind of stuff?
I haven't talked to him about it, no. You know, I mean, the only way you can do it is just to do it. You know, I must confess that I myself shared this view that it was a bit of a leap when he appeared after not being in the country for 30 years. But there is a certain, you know, sense of entitlement that boys often have that girls don't. So, but anyway, I mean, I think now he has dug his shovel in the ground and begun to build his own set of relationships and to learn the ropes. And I think that he's in a much better position. Listen, Pierre Trudeau had never held elected office either when he was sort of plucked. I mean, this is sort of a liberal thing. We'll pluck somebody out and, you know, hope that they will work magic for us.
Do you think he has that sense of entitlement that this job, that he was kind of entitled to this job, given? I mean, he does have an impressive background.
Well, if he did, I think probably the reality of the last couple of years has knocked it out of him, and he realizes that, you know, entitlement, you know, when $3 will buy you a latte. I mean, you really need to work on it yourself. And I wish him well. I mean, I think Canada, for whatever party, deserves good leaders, and I like to see them everywhere. I like to see the ones who stand for what I stand for elected, but I don't think anything is gained by even in parties that you don't support having doofuses or people who lack vision or who lack courage or intelligence. Mainly because people who don't have those qualities are not likely to be able to cooperate on the big issues where people need to come together. And you need to make these astute judgments of when it's time to fight and when it's time to just work together and find a way ahead.
Are you still a conservative?
Well, I am, sort of. I mean, my party doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, I was a progressive conservative. And the merger between Reform/Alliance/ or whatever it was calling itself, and the Progressive Conservatives was uneasy in some ways. And every once in a while I get asked about what I think about Mr. Harper and how he's doing, and I'm always prepared to give credit when I think he does well. But I would say things like, a party that is too socially conservative will not form a government. Or certainly not, and I think that's self-evident. It's not, I mean, I happen to know the politics of my country. And every time I say that, I get, hate mail from people, you stupid, you lost, and blah, 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 what do you think, from the really kind of far-right members of that particular coalition. But the fact of the matter is, I'm very happy. I mean, I supported the Conservative candidate in my riding. Do I buy into everything that Mr. Harper believes? No, but I don't, buy into everything that the Liberals do or anybody else does either. And I think that the voters need alternatives. And I think we need parties, strong parties, who can articulate different visions. And the nature of our political structure means that you need big tent parties, because we have first past the post system. And I think Stephen Harper learned the lesson. I mean, I think Preston Manning has a lot to answer for. I think Preston Manning was a very destructive force in Canadian politics, because he told people things that weren't true about politics, and the politicians are all, in the trough, and then they go to Ottawa and they go, oh, well, it's quite expensive to be a member of Parliament, isn't it? And thanks to us, nobody thinks very much of us when we get out and wants to give us a job. So I think Stephen Harper has grown on the job, and I think he has learned that the people with the more extreme views in his caucus, they're certainly entitled to have their views, and they are certainly entitled to argue for those views, but they don't represent the mainstream of Canadians, and if he lets them take the agenda, he will not form a government. Simple as that.
Let me ask you one last thing in our last 30 seconds here. You're a member, obviously, of a very exclusive club, and the club I'm thinking of here is former Conservative Canadian Prime Ministers. It's you, it's Brian Mulroney, it's Joe Clark. Do you guys ever hang out together or anything like that?
Well, we meet once a year when we do the next great Canadian Prime Minister.
Right.
And this last year, Paul Martin was also with us. And if you know anything about the history, you would be wryly amused at how congenial and nice we all are to each other.
Well, I know all about the history, which is why I'm asking. Do you actually get along?
You know what? Don't sweat the small stuff. It was a privilege to be Prime Minister. I try to take the political capital that I got from that office and use it to good efforts around the world. I have a very happy life with meaningful work, too much travel, wonderful husband. Who cares about those old animosities? Life is bigger than that.
Good enough. Kim Campbell, it's good of you to visit us today, TVO.
My
Thanks so
pleasure.
much.
Thanks.